We're continuing on Masechet Chagigah, and we are inching closer to the end of the Masechta. Today's Amud is being learned for Hatzlacha, Zchut Hatzlacha of Yeshua ben Dina Diana and Yael bat Rivka. Today's Amud is also being learned Leilui Nishmat Sipora bat Yitzchak tat her neshama should have an aliyah. Amen.
Amen.
Now we are in middle of Chavdalet Amud Aleph. We're starting another yet chumrah of Kodesh over Truma, and we started explaining this yesterday, that by Kodesh you have a concept of Revi'i leTum'ah, whereas by Truma you only have Shlishi. Truma never could become Revi'i. We explained the languages that usually are used by Truma and Kodesh, by Taharot, that when you say Pasul, it means it has reached its maximum level of Tum'ah, and when you say Tameh, it means it hasn't yet reached its maximum. You could make another item of the same nature, Tameh, as well. So therefore, by Terumah, the maximum level of Tum'ah is Shlishi leTum'ah. So a Shlishi is already Pasul, not Tameh. But the same thing, Shlishi, for Kodesh would be Tameh, because by Kodesh we have this extra level of Tum'ah that Kodesh could also become Revi'i. LeTum'ah, but there's no Chamishi. Revi'i is the climax, the maximum level that the Tum'ah could reach. How do we know that there is such a thing called Revi'i leTum'ah for Kodesh? In other words, look, when in the Torah, if you touch a corpse, you become Tameh. If now you touch something else, that becomes Tameh. Those things we know. But how many stops can you have? You know, if this touches this, which touches the next one, and that touches the next, that already is not necessarily known to us, midoraita, certainly. Even midrabanan, you need understanding of how do we understand that you have a fourth level of Tum'ah. So that's something that the Gemara is going to deal with over here, and as we will see, it's not so simple. Is this the Oraita? Is this the Rabbanan? Something that's going to be somewhat of a machloket. So says the Gemara, HaRevi'i b'Kodesh Pasul, that the Revi'i becomes Pasul, which again, translation of the Gemara means Pasul but not Tameh. That means Revi'i is the end, the last level that Kodesh could become. It can never become Chamishi. That's just translation, the Taichverter of Revi'i b'Kodesh Pasul. Says the Gemara Tanya, we learned in a Braita, Amar Rabbi Yossi, Minayin la Revi'i b'Kodesh shehu Pasul. How do we know that Revi'i b'Kodesh becomes Pasul? And the Gemara says Vedinu. It is a din. That means a Kal Vachomer. I learned this from Kal Vachomer. Now, what does usually Kal Vachomer mean? If A has this halacha, and A is smaller than B, so then B certainly will have this halacha. That's usually the Kal Vachomer. Now here, as you'll see, Kal Vachomer is a little bit of a different nature, and Rashi is very much bothered with it. We'll try to explain it simply. Says the Gemara, what is the Kal Vachomer? The Kal Vachomer is as such. Vedinu, Uma mechusar kippurim shemutar bitruma pasul b'kodesh or posel b'kodesh. What madach? You have a level of tum'ah that is lower level. It's a mechusar kippurim, a person that needs to bring a korban as a process of their tahara. For instance, you have zav, zava, Mesorah, Yoledet. There are certain people who their Tum'ah requires them not to just count, but also to go to mikveh, meaning, that really goes together, not just to count and go to mikveh, and wait for Harav Shemesh, for the nightfall, but they also have to bring a korban on the 8th day. In Mesorah, he has to go through an entire process, aside from the tiglachat and everything else. He has to wait 7 days. On the 7th day, he does the shaving, he goes to mikveh, he waits until night. What happens when night comes? Now, what could he do? Eat truma. But he's still called a mechusar kippurim. Mechusar kippurim means, literally translated, he's lacking kapara, which means korban. Kapara means korban. His mechusar kippurim, that means he has done his process of tahara, but he's still missing something. What is he missing? Korban tomorrow morning. He has to bring a korban. Right? So he has to bring a korban. What is the difference of the korban and not korban? The difference is, by night, before korban, he could eat terumah, but he cannot eat kodesh. Tomorrow morning, when he brings a korban, he could eat kodesh too. So that's the halacha. So therefore, turns out to be that the mechusar kippurim is mutar for a shlishi betumah, for terumah, which is a level of shlishi, but it can't have revi'i. Can't have something that's higher level of kedusha. Kodesh he cannot eat, because he is still considered not tameh, but mechusar kippurim, he cannot eat kodesh. So says the Gemara, a mechusar kippurim who can eat terumah still can't eat kodesh. So you see that kodesh is a higher level. So shlishi letumah, who can't even eat terumah, certainly should be halacha that if you touch kodesh with it, the kodesh should become tameh. Right? That's the kal vachomer, quote unquote, that the Gemara says. Let's read the words and then point out a massive problem with it. Right? Says the Gemara, again, Madin, Uma mechusar kippurim shemutar bitruma. Mechusar kippurim is allowed to eat teruma, but at the same time is pasul to eat kodesh, cannot eat kodesh. Shedishi, a person at a level of shedishi, shepasul bitruma, that is not even allowed to do teruma. Eno din she'aseh revi'i lakodesh. Isn't it a halacha that he should make kodesh tameh, pasul? That means it will create a next level of tumah called revi'i lakodesh. That means not only you cannot eat it, but if you touch that shelishi to a kodesh, the kodesh will become tameh. The kodesh will become pasul, not tameh. It will become invalid, which would be tameh, which language that we would use properly would be, or become pasul. Now what's the obvious question in this? The obvious question is, and listen, we're going to say this a few times to make it more clear. The obvious question is, whenever you have kal vachomer, right, you only could learn the halacha of kal vachomer, nothing more, right? In other words, you can't say, well, Reuben is richer than Shimon, so when Reuben has $1 million and he's not as rich as Shimon, or however I said it, Reuben is richer than Shimon. Okay, so when Shimon has $1 million, Reuben, who is richer than him, certainly has
$2 million.
You can't say that.
That's what I'm saying.
Right?
Yeah.
You can't say Reuben, who is richer, certainly has $10 million. You don't know. That's not Kal Vachomer. Kal Vachomer would be Reuben, who is richer, certainly has $1 million. This in halacha is called dayo leba min hadin liyot kenidon. That means it's enough for ba min hadin, for the subject of kal vachomer, to be like the halacha of the thing you're learning from, but it can't be more than that, right? If you're learning b'kal vachomer, you're saying if this one has A, certainly that one has A. That's what you learn kal vachomer, because if that one is bigger than this one, then certainly you should have this minimum that the first one has. But you can't say if Shimon has $1 million, then Reuben, who is richer than him, certainly has $1 billion. You can't say that. That's not kal vachomer. That's just words in the air. So this is a big problem. Rashi asks this question. Let's just wait a second. What happened with our general understanding of Dayo leba min hadin lihiyot ken nidon, and he answers two different answers. Without getting into the nitty-gritties of it, Rashi understands that this perhaps is a din d'Rabbanan. The whole reveal tumah, it's not necessarily mideoraita. The point of this kal vachomer is not really the kal vachomer. We know this from a different thing. The kal vachomer is just to top it off, to say it in a way. But if this would have been really the only proof, says Rashi, then enachinami, you will be correct. This is not your conventional kal vachomer. This would be a kal vachomer that's mufrach. It has a problem with it, the problem that we mentioned, because you can't learn revi'ila tumah, which is a new level of tumah, just from kal vachomer, from something that only has shirishila tumah. You can't do that. So therefore, Rashi's understanding is that we don't really need the kal vachomer here. That's just an additional understanding, and really also happens to be that this is the Rabbanan. The Tosafot disagree with Rashi over here. They hold that the concept of it, the Gemara that Rashi brings from, is a specific case, and here actually could be the Oraita. This is just for those who seek better understanding of this. You should take a look at Rashi and try to follow up why this is, but I don't want to make it more confusing than it is. But this, when going through Shas, you have to understand that by Kal Vachomer is one of those things that you could make yourself, right? For instance, there are many things that you cannot make yourself. You need, for instance, Gezerah Shava. The 13 concepts that you have, 13 midot she'Torah nidreshet b'hem, the Braitav Rabbi Ishmael that we say in the morning, not every one of the 13, me and you could do ourselves. Sometimes the Gemara says is Gezerah Shava. You have a word here, right? You have tetvav, and you learn halachot from Pesach to Sukkot, right? How do you know that you have to eat a kazayit of bread in the Sukkah, the first night of Sukkah, mideoraita? Well, you learn it from the kazayit of matzah on the tetvav benisan, because the tetvav have been compared, the Pesach night and Sukkot night are being compared. Gezerah Shava means you take, it's a copy and paste. You copy the halachot of here to the other one that the Torah compares them. But that, you need a Kabbalah Moshe Misina. You need a tradition. You can't make your own Gezerah Shava. You need a tradition that this has been compared with this. But Kal Vachomer is just pure logic. Me and you could make Kal Vachomer. But at the same time, Kal Vachomer has to be a proper Kal Vachomer. And Rashi says over here, this Kal Vachomer is not a proper Kal Vachomer, and therefore we use it only as a top off, as saying something additional. We really didn't. This is the second answer that Rashi gives. But be that as it may, going through Shas, there will be a concept that you have to bear in mind. Dayo leba min hadin liot kenidon. When you do Kal Vachomer, you could only prove that same din that the first one has, nothing more than that, right? So if $1 million, in our example, is what Shimon has, Reuben would only be provable that has $1 million, not a cent more. That would be Kal Vachomer. If you want to say Reuben has $2 million, that's not already part of Kal Vachomer. That's what the Gemara is saying over here. The Gemara says, well, if Shlishi letumah is pasur for terumah, certainly you should make Revi'i letumah for Kodesh. Right? That's jumping one stage, and that certainly is not part of the actual Kal Vachomer. So says the Gemara, well, the Gemara here for our purposes calls this a Kal Vachomer. So says the Gemara like this. ומה מחוסר כיפורים שמותר בתרומה פסול בקודש, שלישי שפסול בתרומה אין עוד דין שיעשה רביעי לקודש. Now the Gemara sums it up. ולמדנו שלישי לקודש מן התורה, and שלישי לקודש we learn from the Torah, that the pasuk says already, as we're going to have right now. We're going to see how we learn that. ורביעי בקל וחומר. And Revi'i we learn from this din of Kal Vachomer that we just mentioned. So the Gemara says, I just explained to you how we have Revi'i, right? We have Shlishi letumah min Torah, And I just explained to you how we have in Kal Vachomer, Revi'i letum'ah. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam she'akol nהיה b'dvaro.
Amen.
Now, how do we know Shlishi LaKodesh min HaTorah? Shlishi LaKodesh min HaTorah minayin? Dichtiv, because it says, V'habasar asher yiga bechol tameh. If you have a basar that touches tum'ah, lo ya'achel, cannot be eaten. Now, how do you translate this? Simple. Habasar asher yiga bechol tameh, in any level of tum'ah. What is the minimum level of tum'ah that is mentioned as tum'ah in the Torah? Is Sheni LaKodesh called tum'ah in the pasuk? Well, it is, because it says if you have a barrel and has its content, if you take something that's tameh inside the cavity of the air inside of this kli, then the kli becomes tameh, and it's metameh the content of it as well, right? So it says the Gemara, Milo askinan de naga besheni. Aren't we calling a sheni also a tum'ah? Because that would be, it says, if you put this tum'ah inside the cavity of a kli, the kli becomes tameh, and it's metameh the content inside as well. Now the content becomes sheni letumah, maximum, right? But that the Torah is still calling that tameh. So when the Torah elsewhere over here by us says bechol tameh, any tumah, it should be also including sheni letumah, right? It's not just avi avot tumah, which is corpse, ava tumah, which is tamemet, or rishon latumah, but it's also sheni latumah. Because in our example that we gave, right, the keli becomes rishon, and it makes the food inside of it sheni latumah. So when the Torah says bechol tameh, in any level of tumah, it must be including any level that the Torah elsewhere calls tumah, and sheni latumah is one such example. So far clear? Yes? Again, the Torah elsewhere in the halachot of what creates tum'ah, the Torah says if you enter a piece of tum'ah inside the cavity of a kli cheres, and the kli cheres has a content of food, the food becomes tameh. The Torah says that food is tameh, calls it tameh. Now what level of tum'ah is that? Is sheni latumah. Forget about how that is sheni. So it turns out that the Torah calls something that's sheni latumah tameh. That's a tameh level d'oraita. Right?
Okay.
Good? So far? Now, by us, over here, it says, V'habasar asher yiga bechol tameh lo yachel. The meat that touches any level of tum'ah, lo yachel, you cannot eat. Right? The full pasuk is habasar asher yiga bechol tameh lo yachel ba'esh yisaref. It's talking about the avodah of the Beit HaMikdash. You have kochim. If you touch any tameh, it becomes not edible. You have to burn it. So what is the level of kol tameh? What's the minimum tum'ah that this basar would touch and it will become tameh? Well, says the Gemara, it could be even sheni letumah. For sure, if he touches a corpse, it becomes tameh. For sure, it becomes tameh if he touches a tum'at met. For sure, it becomes tameh if he touches a rishon letumah. How about sheni letumah? Says the Gemara, of course, because it says kol tameh, any tameh, and I found you just right now that elsewhere the Torah calls the sheni letumah also tameh. Okay? So says the Gemara, and how do we know it? Because it says, "Ve'abasar asher yiga bechol tameh lo yachel, milo askiran denaga b'sheni ve'kama rachmana lo yachel." it touched Sheni, and it's still the Torah says Lo Yachel, which means it becomes what? Becomes what? Tameh, which means what level of Tub'ah? Shlishi. So you see the Torah itself says, introduces to be Shlishi. That you don't need rabbinic, you don't need Kavachomer, you don't need anything. It says it in the Torah that Kodshim touches any level of Tum'ah, it becomes Tameh. And then Revi'i Mikal Vachomer, Hada Amaran. And Revi'i Mikal Vachomer, we learned the way we said it. Like however you understand that Revi'i, whether it's the Rabbanan, whether it's the Oraita, from Rashi and Tosafot, is what we said already.
So this meat that we're talking about with this pasuk is Kodesh meat.
Yeah. So says the Gemara. Next Chumrah that we learned in the Mishnah for Kodesh over Terumah was, you remember, if by Terumah one hand of mine became Tameh, what's the halacha? Tumah D'Rabbanan. Let's review this a little bit. If you have a Torah level of Tum'ah, if I touch a dead body with one of my hands, right? Can I eat terumah with my other hand? No. Close this in my back? No, because once you touch, the whole body is tameh. There's no such a thing as tum'at yadayim alone. If you touch a corpse, your entire body is tameh, period. Immediately. If you go under ohel met, your whole body is tameh, period. When we talk about tum'at yadayim, that only my hands are tameh, it's tum'ah b'd'Rabbanan. So by tum'ah b'd'Rabbanan, if I want to eat terumah, the Mishnah said, if my left hand touched tum'ah, a source of tum'ah d'Rabbanan, only this hand is tameh. I could put this in my back and eat terumah with this hand. But by Kodesh, you cannot do that. Right? One hand makes the other one tameh. Now, we understood perhaps that it just becomes, the whole body becomes tameh. As we'll see, that's not what the Mishnah meant. The Mishnah meant that it has to be somewhat attached, and now the Gemara is going to explain this. In other words, it doesn't mean that if one hand became tameh and it never touched my other hand ever, I can't eat with this hand. It means that this hand became in contact with the other hand and then becomes tameh. Now the question in the Gemara is going to be the following. Does it mean that I touch this hand and now I want to eat with this hand, having this one tied in my back? Or does it talk about the case that I am holding the item in my hand and this hand of mine is touching or touched this hand while holding the food? And then we are choshesh, we are concerned that you're going to touch this once you're touching your hand. Which one of those understanding is going to be the machloket in the Gemara? But as we said, it is not going to be a case that you never touched the other hand with your tameh hand, right? Again, everything is tumah d'Rabbanan over here, not tumah d'oraita. So let's read the words of the Gemara. Uvetruma im nitmet, we read in the Mishnah that in terumah, if one hand became tameh, the other one is fine. By kodesh, it would not be fine. Amar Rav Shizbi. Rav Shizbi says, Bechiburin shanu. The only case that Mishnah says it's going to be a problem with kodesh is I'm holding the kodesh in my hand, and my other hand that became tameh is touching this hand, is mechubar, right? Is connected. Then the kodesh becomes, we assume that the kodesh became pasul, and you can't eat that kodesh. That's the case. Bechiburin shanu. Avar shelo bechiburin, but if your tameh hand is not attached to your other hand, lo, then there's no problem. You can even eat kodesh with the other hand. It's about Abaye. Abaye asked the question on Rav Shizbi. Yad neguva metameh chaverta. If you have a dry hand, and this is going to become important, this word, neguva, if you have a dry hand, metameh chaverta, it could make the other hand tameh, letameh kodesh, to go ahead and now make the kodesh tameh, avalo litruma. Now translate this, Rabotai, with me. What does it mean? If I have a hand that is tameh, right? So tumat yadayim of the Rabbanan is what level? Second, sheniyot latuma, right? These are pashut things. We're just saying them over. We have said this many times. To review, you have tumat sheni, my hand. Yavesh, there's no water, right? If it would be water, the water becomes rishon, right? We learned this, and then it goes back and makes the other hand sheni also. That's pashut. But if it's dry, right? If my hand is tameh sheni letuma and it's completely dry, now I touch my other hand. Touched it. Now, what is this hand right now? So says Abaye, the Braita tells you that this hand right now is sheni latuma, and therefore, if you now touch this kodesh, the kodesh becomes shlishi latuma. Therefore, it says metameh bakodesh, not posel. Metameh means what level? Shlishi, because now I could go and make another piece of kodesh, pasul, make it revi'i latuma. So therefore, hand sheni, you touch it, this becomes sheni. You touch this kodesh, this becomes shlishi. This touches another piece of kodesh, it becomes revi'i, right? And my hand was dry, but not litruma. That means, even though that technically speaking, I would say, oh well, sheni, if this piece was not kodesh, was teruma, this should become pasul. No. It's a chumrah of kodesh. It doesn't make my hand touching my other hand. If this was not tameh by itself, if this touched this yavesh, I touch teruma, you're good to go. It's not tameh. It's not pasul. So let's read this again in the words. Abaye brings this braita. Yad neguva metameh achaverta. If you touch the other hand, it makes the other hand tameh letameh lekodesh, to make kodesh shlishi latuma. Aval lo litruma, but it does not posel the teruma. Divrei Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda. This is the words, the psak of Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda, right? Sorry, Divrei Rabbi. Sorry about that. Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda Omer. Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda says no. Lifsol avalo letameh. That means your hand is sheni. You touch this other hand, this becomes not sheni, but shlishi. And therefore, when you touch kodesh, what does happen? Happens? This becomes revi'i, which is pasul, but not tameh. It's more understandable why the difference between teruma and kodesh. So Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda says, if my hand, my left hand became tameh, tumah darabanan, so it's sheni letumah, and dry without any water, I touch my other hand, we assume that this is now shlishi letumah, so to speak, and therefore if I touch kodesh, it makes the kodesh revi'i letumah. But of course, if I would touch teruma, what would happen? Nothing.
But can a hand become shlishi?
No. It's all chumras. But this is more understandable than Rebbe. Rebbe says, very interesting, it says, this is sheni, makes this shlishi, but not teruma. Teruma becomes nothing. Even though that should follow that if my hand is sheni and I touch teruma, should become pasul. It says lo letruma. Okay? So it says the Gemara. Now let's see what Abaye is very sharp, right? And he wants to read this and make a question on Rav Shizbi. Remember, Rav Shizbi said what? We're talking about a case that I am holding this and I'm holding this hand with my other hand, and that's the case of the Mishnah that creates problem, right? When the Mishnah says that one hand is metameh chaverta, doesn't mean automatically, but it means I'm holding this and other hand is touching bechiburin shanu. It's talking about a case that's attached, right? So says Abaye, it doesn't make sense. If you say that my hands did not touch, at the time of touching Kodesh, meaning it's not this case. It's just that this became Tameh. I touched this hand, and now this is out of the picture, and now I'm touching. If that's the case, it makes sense. But if you want to say that the case is Chiburin, it doesn't make sense. Why not? Says Abaye like this. And this is his kasha on Rav Shizbi. Says the Gemara, Hainu rebuta de neguva. That's why neguva makes a chiluk. If you tell me that at the time that I touch Kodesh, my other hand, original tum'ah, original tameh hand is out of the picture, then it makes sense why the chidush of Rebbe of saying this hand was dry. That even though that the hand was dry and the tum'ah should go one level down, it doesn't go down. It touches this, everything dry, this becomes the same tum'ah as this becomes sheni. Right? That's a big chidush. That's the chidush of Rebbe, and therefore he has to make sure to tell you neguva, even a dry hand. Right? Because if it would be wet, it would be pashut. Because what happens with yadayim that's sheni letum'ah, we learned this by the sugya of Hillel and Bet Shammai in brachot, right? Remember that? If this is sheni letum'ah, and it's wet, the water becomes what? Rishon. And if the wet hand touches the other, of course this hand becomes sheni from the water that became rishon. That's pashut. So what's the chidush of Rebbe? The chidush is, even if it's neguva, even if everything is dry, still this becomes sheni, and that's the chumrah that we have by Kodesh. That's the whole chidush. Otherwise, it's not the chumrah; it's the reality. So therefore, I understand why Rebbe has to say is dry and still. But if you're telling me, says Abaye, that I am touching this, and the whole chashash is that I'm going to touch this somehow because my hand is attached, right? Somehow my hand is not out of the picture, and hands touch things, and therefore I'm worried that it's going to touch this. Then who cares if it's dry or is it wet? It makes zero difference. Because your chashash is that my hand is going to touch the Kodesh. The original hand is going to touch the Kodesh. If my hand's going to touch the Kodesh, does it make a difference if it's dry or wet? Absolutely not. So why in the world would Rebbe say, Yadayim neguvot? What's the chidush of neguvot? It makes no difference. And therefore, the simple read of the Braita of Machlokat Rebbe, Rabbi Yosef Rabbi Yehuda, is that it's not b'mechubarin. It's not that my hand is touching the other hand. It's my hand that touched this, and then I'm touching this separately with this hand being out of the picture. That's how he says it, right? Let's just leave this in midway over here. Just read the words, and then we'll pick this up tomorrow. Hainu rebuta de neguva. That's the chidush of neguva. If your hand, original tameh hand, touched this and now it's out of the picture, then I understand what the extra chidush, the extra limud from being dry is, right? But if you say, but if the hands are touching, right, and your chashash is that I'm going to come to touch the Kodesh, then there should be no difference between dry or wet, so therefore you can't read it like that. What's the chidush of neguva? And therefore it will be, Abaye says, not like Rav Shizbi. That the halacha is not, the Mishnah is not talking about the case that you're holding the Kodesh and your hand is holding this, but rather it is the original thing that we said, that your hand is sheni letumah. If you touched your other hand, this hand by itself now, without need of the original hand, could be metameh the Kodesh, but not terumah, and Bezat Hashem will pick this up tomorrow morning.